She placed the pistol on the table between them. "I came here to kill you, Mr. Holmes." The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and Sherlock Holmes did not move. What kind of woman walks into 221B Baker Street, calm, composed, with murder in her handbag? And what kind of truth could stop her finger from pulling the trigger? Stay with me, because tonight's story is not about a crime. It's about grief, justice, and the dangerous weight of being right. Before we begin, welcome to Holmes Deduction Diaries. If you love deep psychological Sherlock mysteries, not just cases but stories that stay with you, then you're in the right place. I want to know something before we step into Baker Street. Where are you watching from, and how old are you? Write your location and age in the comments below. I read every single one, and it's always fascinating to see how far Holmes's mind travels across the world. Now, let us return to the evening when everything began. Chapter 1. The Color of the Evening. October had settled upon London, not with the dramatic fogs that so often characterize the popular imagination of the city, but with something far more subtle, a patient, almost tender diminishment of the afternoons, as though the season were drawing a silk curtain across the hours, 1 degree of light at a time. The trees along Baker Street had begun their slow confession of color, releasing leaves of amber and rust onto the pavement below, where they gathered in quiet drifts against the iron railings and along the edges of the curb. It was the kind of autumn that did not demand attention, but rewarded it, the kind that revealed itself only to those who paused long enough to notice the particular way the gaslight caught the mist at 5:30, or how the chimney smoke rose straighter in the cooling air, as though even it had lost the energy for wandering. I had spent the better part of that day attending to the small, necessary labors of my practice, a swollen ankle in Marylebone, a child's croup in Wigmore Street, and a long conversation with an elderly widow near Regent's Park, whose chief complaint, I gradually understood, was not the neuralgia she described with such clinical precision, but the silence of a house that had once held 4 voices and now held only her own. I had listened with the particular attentiveness that such patients require, the kind that involves not merely the ear, but the posture, the expression, the unhurried quality of one's breathing. And when I left her, she thanked me with a warmth that had nothing whatever to do with the tincture I had prescribed and everything to do with the 40 minutes I had spent in her parlor, drinking indifferent tea and allowing her to speak about her late husband's fondness for military history. Such encounters, I have found, constitute the truest substance of a medical life. The dramatic cases, the fevers, the fractures, the urgent summons in the small hours, these are what the public imagines when they think of a doctor's work. But the greater portion of healing occurs in quieter rooms, through quieter means, and I had long since ceased to measure the value of my days by the severity of the conditions I treated. A patient comforted is a patient served, whatever the textbooks might say about the hierarchy of disease. By the time I returned to Baker Street, the afternoon had completed its gentle retreat. The sky above the rooftops held that particular quality of deep, luminous gray that appears only in the brief interval between the last of the daylight and the full assertion of the dark. A color that has no proper name in English, though I suspect the Germans, with their gift for compound precision, have found one. The sitting room, when I entered it, was warm with the steady heat of a coal fire that Mrs. Hudson had evidently tended in my absence, and the familiar scent of the place, tobacco, old paper, the faint chemical trace that never entirely left Holmes's possessions, settled around me with the comforting weight of long association. I removed my coat, placed my medical bag in its accustomed corner, and lowered myself into my armchair with the particular gratitude that an afternoon of house calls bestows upon a man of middle years. The cushion received me with the loyalty of an old friend. The fire muttered and shifted in the grate. Above the mantelpiece, the clock measured the silence with its familiar, unhurried voice. each tick a small, precise affirmation that time was passing exactly as it should, neither too quickly nor too slowly, and that nothing whatsoever was required of me in this moment except to be precisely where I was. Through the window, the city was composing itself for evening. A hansom passed below, its wheels turning through the fallen leaves with a sound like a whispered confidence. Somewhere to the south, a church bell marked the hour. Not the grand assertive bells of Westminster, but something smaller and nearer, a parish bell whose tone carried the modest authority of local custom rather than national ceremony. The lamplighter had not yet begun his rounds, and the street existed in that transitional dimness where shapes are still recognizable but have begun to lose their hard edges, softening into suggestions of themselves. It was, in every particular, an evening designed for stillness, for the slow perusal of a book one has read before, for the second cup of tea that one drinks not from thirst, but from the simple pleasure of warmth between one's hands, for the kind of thought that wanders without destination and returns enriched by the journey. I let my gaze drift from the window toward the interior of the room, toward the figure seated in the chair opposite mine, and felt, as I had felt 1,000 times before in that room, in that light, in that company, the quiet, unremarkable, irreplaceable contentment of being home. A study in stillness. Holmes occupied his chair with the particular quality of repose that I had learned over many years of close observation to distinguish from its several counterparts. There was the restless stillness of a mind between cases, dangerous, volatile, apt to discharge itself upon the furniture or the wall with a revolver. There was the performative stillness he occasionally adopted when he wished me to believe he was calm, while his thoughts raced behind the mask of his features like hounds unleashed in a closed park. And there was this, the rarest variety, a stillness that appeared to be genuine, unforced, and rooted in something that approached, if I dare use the word in connection with Sherlock Holmes, contentment. He was reading. The volume in his hands was slim, bound in a faded green cloth that suggested a university press publication of some decades past, and he turned its pages with a care that bordered on the reverential, that slow, deliberate motion of the fingers that indicates not merely reading but savoring, the way a man might turn a glass of exceptional wine rather than simply drinking it. I caught a glimpse of the title as the firelight shifted across the cover, a monograph on the stained glass of Chartres Cathedral, written in French by an author whose name I did not recognize, but whose work had evidently captured Holmes's attention with uncommon thoroughness. This was not, I should note, entirely surprising. Holmes's intellectual appetites, though popularly understood to be narrow and exclusively practical, were in truth far more varied than the public, or indeed my own published accounts, had generally conveyed. He could dismiss entire fields of knowledge with a wave of his hand when they bore no relation to his work, yet pursue the most esoteric byways of art, chemistry, or history with a passion that bordered on the devotional when something in the subject caught his particular fancy. The medieval glaziers, it appeared, had caught it this evening, and I watched him read with the quiet satisfaction of a man observing a friend in a state of rare and genuine peace. His dressing gown, the mouse-colored one, not the more famous purple, was drawn about his lean frame with the comfortable disorder of long wear. His pipe lay extinguished in the ashtray beside him, abandoned not in frustration but in the natural course of a man too absorbed in his reading to maintain the ritual of tobacco. His brow, so often furrowed with the intensity of deductive concentration, was smooth. His breathing was even. The sharp, hawkish quality that characterized his features in moments of professional engagement had softened into something almost contemplative, and I was struck, not for the first time, by the thought that Holmes in repose was a fundamentally different creature from Holmes on the hunt, not diminished, but translated into a quieter key, like a symphony heard through the wall of an adjacent room. I did not disturb him. The years had taught me the value of these intervals, both for his well-being and for my own. There was a companionship in shared silence that no conversation, however stimulating, could quite replicate. The particular comfort of two people occupying the same space without any obligation to fill it with speech, each engaged in his own occupation yet connected by the simple, sustaining fact of the other's presence. I had known marriages built on less. The fire settled in the grate with a soft exhalation of sparks, and the clock continued its patient accounting of the minutes. Outside, the darkness had advanced another degree, and the window now reflected the interior of the room more than it revealed the street beyond. Our lamps, our books, our two chairs drawn close to the hearth, doubled in the glass like a painting of domestic life rendered by some Dutch master of the ordinary. I had just begun to consider whether I might ring for tea when Holmes raised his head from the monograph, tilted it slightly to one side in that characteristic gesture of arrested attention, and appeared to listen to something that I, for all my years of proximity to his extraordinary faculties, had not yet heard. His eyes did not move to the door. They moved to me, and in them I saw the first faint spark of that alertness which, in Sherlock Holmes, functioned as other men's entire vocabularies of alarm. Mrs. Hudson's knock. The sound, when it came, was so familiar that I might have missed it entirely had Holmes's attention not already primed my own. Mrs. Hudson's knock upon the sitting-room door possessed a grammar all its own, a language of small percussive signals that I had unconsciously catalogued over the years without ever troubling to articulate. Her morning knock, accompanying the breakfast tray, was brisk and rhythmic, the knock of a woman with a schedule to maintain and other rooms to attend to. Her knock when delivering post was lighter, almost parenthetical, as though she considered the Royal Mail a minor interruption scarcely worthy of full-knuckle engagement. Her knock when she disapproved of something, the hour, the visitor, the state of the sitting-room carpet following one of Holmes's more adventurous chemical experiments, carried a clipped, martial quality that communicated volumes before she uttered a single word. This knock was different. It held a note of gentle enquiry, the knock of a woman who suspects she may be interrupting something, but judges the interruption necessary. Two measured strikes, a pause, then a third, slightly softer, as though the hand had begun the motion with purpose but ended it with apology. "Come in, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes called, and I noticed that he had closed his monograph upon one finger, marking his page with the practiced economy of a man who expects the interruption to be brief, but is prepared for it to be otherwise. Our landlady entered with the particular expression she reserved for the announcement of unscheduled visitors, a blend of professional hospitality and personal inconvenience that she managed with admirable diplomatic balance. Mrs. Hudson was, in her quiet way, one of the most formidable women I have ever known. The management of a household that included Sherlock Holmes required not merely patience, but a kind of constitutional resilience, a deep and abiding capacity to absorb irregularity without permitting it to disturb one's fundamental sense of order. That she had maintained this capacity across years of bullet holes in the plaster, malodorous chemical experiments, and visitors arriving at every conceivable hour was a testament to a strength of character that I fear neither Holmes nor I adequately acknowledged at the time. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Holmes," she said, standing in the doorway with her hands clasped before her, in that posture of composed announcement that I knew so well. "There is a lady downstairs who asks if she might see you. She has no appointment, but she is very—" Mrs. Hudson paused, selecting her word with the care of a woman who prided herself on precision. "She is very composed, sir, and she did say it was a private matter." Holmes glanced toward the window, where the reflected room glowed against the darkness of the street, and I saw him register the hour. It was past 6, later than most clients called, and well into the territory of the evening that custom generally reserved for domestic rather than professional pursuits. A woman calling alone without appointment at such an hour suggested a matter of some personal urgency, though the word Mrs. Hudson had chosen, composed, argued against the kind of desperate, tearful appeal that sometimes brought clients to our door in the later hours. "Did she give her name?" Holmes asked. "Mrs. Graves, sir. Mrs. Eleanor Graves of Hertfordshire." Holmes received the name with no visible reaction, which, in itself, was a reaction I had learned to read. When a client's name meant nothing to him, he typically dismissed it with a brief nod. When it meant something, he grew very still. This fell into neither category. He simply inclined his head, set his monograph upon the side table with the green cover facing upward, and said, with a courtesy that contained no eagerness but no reluctance, "Please show her up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps a pot of tea, if it would not be too much trouble at this hour." Mrs. Hudson, who could produce tea at any hour with the reliability of a natural law, gave a small nod and withdrew. Her footsteps descended the staircase with their customary even rhythm, and in the brief interval that followed, the space between announcement and arrival, the sitting room seemed to gather itself as a stage gathers itself in the moment before the curtain rises, not with drama, but with a quiet, expectant attention to whatever was about to enter from the wings. The woman on the stair. I have often reflected upon how much may be learned from the sound of a person's approach before one has laid eyes upon them. The staircase at 221B Baker Street, with its 17 steps of seasoned oak, functioned as an inadvertent instrument of revelation, each tread producing a note that varied according to the weight, pace, confidence, and emotional condition of the person ascending. I had heard those stairs articulate panic, determination, exhaustion, arrogance, and grief, each rendered in the distinctive percussion of shoe leather against wood, and I had learned to form preliminary impressions from this evidence alone with a reliability that, while it could not rival Holmes's deductive precision, served me well enough as a physician accustomed to reading the body's involuntary testimony. The footsteps now ascending were measured and deliberate. They ascended neither quickly nor slowly, maintaining a rhythm that suggested a person who had considered the pace of her approach and chosen one that communicated neither urgency nor hesitation. Each step fell with a clean, definite contact, not the heavy tread of physical weariness, nor the tentative placement of someone unsure of their welcome, but the steady, purposeful gait of a woman who had decided upon her course and intended to hold to it. There was, I noted with the particular attention that Holmes's influence had cultivated in me over the years, no pause at the landing, no moment of recollection or reassessment before the final approach to our door. Whoever this woman was, she did not need to gather herself. She arrived gathered. The door, which Mrs. Hudson had left slightly ajar upon her descent, opened fully, and Mrs. Eleanor Graves entered the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. My first impression was one of quiet distinction. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years of age, though the precision of such estimates grows increasingly unreliable as one advances through one's own middle years. With features that bore the evidence of what must once have been considerable beauty and had matured into something more interesting. A face shaped by experience rather than merely by nature, with fine lines about the eyes that spoke of years spent in both laughter and concern, though the latter, I suspected, had predominated of late. Her hair, visible beneath a hat of modest but well-chosen design, was dark with threads of silver distributed through it in the manner of a natural process neither resisted nor concealed. Her eyes were gray, clear, and possessed of a steadiness that I found immediately striking. The gaze of a woman accustomed to meeting the world directly, without the mediating veil of social performance that so many of her sex were trained from girlhood to maintain. She was dressed in mourning. Not the full, heavy mourning of recent bereavement, the oppressive blacks and dense crepes that transform a woman into a walking monument to loss, but the quieter, more enduring mourning of a later stage. Dark fabrics of good quality, well-maintained but not new, worn with the ease of long habit rather than the stiffness of fresh grief. A small brooch at her throat, jet, set in silver, of the kind that serves as both ornament and declaration, confirmed what her clothing suggested. This was a woman for whom loss was not an event, but a condition, not something that had happened to her, but something she carried with her as naturally as her own shadow. Her traveling case was leather, dark brown, of a quality that suggested comfortable means without ostentation, and she carried it in her left hand with a grip that was firm but not white-knuckled. The grip of a woman holding something she intended to keep close. Her gloves were buttoned to the wrist with a precision that I found, for reasons I could not immediately articulate, faintly remarkable. Everything about her, her posture, her dress, her measured entry into an unfamiliar room, communicated a composure so thorough that it seemed less like a natural state than like an achievement, something built and maintained through sustained effort of will. Holmes had risen from his chair, a courtesy he extended to female clients, with an automatic grace that never varied regardless of his interest in their cases, and stood regarding her with an expression of attentive welcome that, to anyone unfamiliar with his methods, would have appeared entirely social. I, who knew him better, recognized the rapid, almost imperceptible movements of his eyes as they passed across her figure, cataloging, assessing, filing, the great engine of his observation already in motion behind the courteous facade of his greeting. The courtesies of a rival. "Mrs. Graves," Holmes said, and his voice carried that particular warmth he reserved for the opening moments of a consultation. Not effusive, never ingratiating, but possessing a quality of calm authority that I had seen settle the nerves of even the most agitated visitors. "Please do come in. You must allow me to offer you the chair nearest the fire. The evening has turned decidedly cool, and I suspect your journey from Hertfordshire has been a long one." If Mrs. Graves was surprised that Holmes had already identified the general region of her origin, a deduction that might have been drawn from Mrs. Hudson's introduction or from a dozen small indicators visible to his trained eye, she gave no sign of it. She inclined her head with a slight acknowledging smile that touched her lips but did not reach her eyes, and moved to the basket chair that Holmes indicated with a grace that confirmed my earlier impression of a woman for whom composure was a practiced discipline rather than an effortless gift. "You are very kind, Mr. Holmes," she said, and her voice completed the portrait that her appearance had begun. It was a voice of moderate pitch and careful modulation, educated, unhurried, with a faint trace of something I could not immediately place, a quality not of accent, but of restraint, as though each word had been weighed before it was released into the air. "And you must be Dr. Watson. I have read your accounts with great interest." I murmured something appropriate, struck by the fact that her acknowledgment of me, so often omitted or perfunctory in clients whose attention was understandably fixed upon Holmes, carried a warmth that seemed genuine rather than merely courteous. She settled into the basket chair, with the careful movements of a woman conscious of her own presentation, arranging her skirts with an economy of motion and placing her traveling case upon the floor beside her, close to her left hand, in a position that allowed easy access while maintaining the appearance of casual placement. Mrs. Hudson appeared with the tea tray, that miraculous production of hospitality that seemed to materialize in our sitting room with the inevitability of a natural phenomenon. And the small ritual of pouring and distributing occupied the next several minutes with its familiar, soothing choreography. I noted that Mrs. Graves accepted her cup with steady hands and raised it to her lips without the faintest tremor. She took her tea without sugar, with a small measure of milk, details that, in the Holmesian economy of observation, doubtless communicated something I was not equipped to decode, but which I registered nonetheless with the habitual attentiveness that years in Holmes's company had made second nature. The lamp beside Holmes's chair cast a warm, contained circle of light that encompassed the three of us in a shared illumination, while the corners of the room retreated into comfortable shadow. The fire continued its quiet commentary in the grate, and the clock, that faithful custodian of the passing minutes, maintained its steady, reassuring measure. For a brief interval, the scene might have been any evening visit between acquaintances. Three people of mature years, seated in a warm room, sharing tea while the October darkness pressed against the windows with polite but unmistakable authority. It was Holmes who moved the moment from social to professional, and he did so with a transition so smooth that it scarcely registered as a change of register at all. He had been observing Mrs. Graves throughout the ritual of tea with that quality of relaxed attention that concealed, I knew, the most intense analytical scrutiny. His gaze resting upon her hands, her brooch, her shoes, the precise way she held her cup, the minute adjustments of her posture as she settled into the unfamiliar chair. Now he set down his own cup with a quiet, definitive sound and leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who has completed a preliminary assessment and is prepared to hear whatever his visitor has come to say. "Now then, Mrs. Graves," he said, and his tone, while still warm, had acquired the faintest additional edge of professional clarity, the voice of a man whose time, though freely given, was understood by all parties to possess considerable value. "You mentioned to Mrs. Hudson that you wished to consult me on a private matter. Pray take your time. We are entirely at your disposal, and the evening, as you see, is not otherwise engaged." Mrs. Graves set down her teacup. The motion was small, deliberate, and, to my eye, faintly ceremonial, as though she were setting aside not merely a cup, but the last of the preliminary courtesies, preparing to cross the threshold from visitor to client. She folded her hands in her lap with that same precise composure I had noted throughout, and when she raised her eyes to meet Holmes, I saw in them a steadiness of purpose that went far beyond the ordinary anxiety of a person seeking professional help. She was ready to speak, and the room, the warm, lamplit, fire-murmuring room that had held 1,000 such consultations, was ready to receive whatever she had carried with her from Hertfordshire through the October evening, up the 17 stairs of 221B Baker Street. Chapter 2. The Brooch and the Grief Beneath. "It will seem a small matter, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Graves began, and there was in her opening words a quality of careful self-deprecation that I recognized from long experience as the preamble of a client who fears that the thing most precious to them will appear trivial to the world. "I am aware that you are accustomed to affairs of far greater consequence, and I confess I hesitated for some weeks before presuming to impose upon your time. But I have exhausted the more conventional avenues of inquiry, and I find myself at a point where I must either seek exceptional help or resign myself to a loss I am not yet prepared to accept." She paused, not for dramatic effect, I thought, but from the genuine difficulty of translating private grief into public language, and then continued in a voice whose steadiness I found increasingly remarkable, given the depth of feeling that occasionally surfaced in her eyes before being swiftly and firmly subdued. "The matter concerns a brooch, a cameo brooch to be precise, which has been in my family for 3 generations, and which has gone missing from my home under circumstances I find troubling." She described it with the loving particularity of a woman for whom the object existed not merely as an ornament, but as a vessel of memory, a physical anchor connecting her to the continuity of her family's history. The brooch, she explained, was an oval shell cameo of modest dimensions, perhaps 2 inches in length, depicting the figure of Persephone in profile, carved with a delicacy that suggested Italian craftsmanship of the early part of the century. The shell was set in a surround of gold filigree, fine but not ostentatious, and the whole was fitted with a simple pin clasp that bore the marks of having been repaired at least once during its long life. "Its monetary value," Mrs. Graves said, with the quiet precision of a woman who has already anticipated the question, "is not considerable. I have had it assessed, at the time of my late husband's estate, at no more than £15. It is not the sort of piece that would attract a professional thief or command attention in any reputable auction house." She paused again, and this time the steadiness in her voice required a more visible effort to maintain. But it was my grandmother's, Mr. Holmes. She wore it on her wedding day, and my mother after her, and I—" She stopped, gathered herself with a discipline that spoke of long practice, and resumed. "It is the only object I possess that carries the touch of 3 generations of the women in my family. Its loss is not financial, it is—I hope you will not think me sentimental—it is personal in a way I find difficult to adequately express." I was moved. The restraint of her account, the evident effort she made to contain her emotion within the boundaries of rational discourse, affected me more deeply than any display of tears could have done. I had encountered, in my medical practice, many varieties of grief, and I had learned that the most profound losses were often those that the world would judge as minor, not the grand bereavements that society recognized and ritualized, but the small private deprivations, a letter lost, a garden abandoned, a familiar view altered beyond recognition, that severed the delicate threads connecting a person to their own past. Mrs. Graves's brooch, I understood, was such a thread, and its loss had left her untethered in a way that no one who had not experienced a similar severance could fully comprehend. Holmes listened with an attention that I recognized as genuine rather than merely professional. His eyes remained upon her face throughout her account, and I noted the absence of the small, impatient gestures, the drumming of fingers, the slight forward lean that preceded an interruption, that characterized his reception of cases that failed to engage him. He was engaged, but there was something else in his manner, something I could not quite identify, a quality of watchfulness that exceeded what the apparent nature of the case seemed to warrant, as though he were listening not only to what Mrs. Graves was saying, but to the spaces between her words, the architecture of her silences, the structure of the story she had chosen to tell. Holmes' first questions. When Mrs. Graves had concluded her account of the brooch, its history, its significance, and the depth of its loss, Holmes allowed a moment of silence to settle between them before he spoke. It was a characteristic pause, one I had observed countless times, not the silence of a man formulating his first question, but of a man selecting from among dozens the one most likely to illuminate what lay beneath the surface of what he had just heard. "You mentioned, Mrs. Graves, that the brooch went missing under circumstances you found troubling," he said, his voice carrying the measured, unhurried cadence he adopted when beginning an interrogation he expected to be delicate. "I wonder if you might elaborate upon what it was precisely that troubled you. A missing object is, after all, merely misplaced until evidence suggests otherwise." Mrs. Graves nodded, as though she had anticipated the question and approved of its precision. "The brooch was kept in my writing desk," she said. "A small rosewood desk in my private sitting room. Not the formal parlor, you understand, but the room I use for correspondence, reading, and the general management of the household. The desk has a shallow drawer, fitted with a lock, in which I keep those items of personal value that I wish to have close to hand but not exposed to casual observation. The brooch was always there. I wore it only on particular occasions, anniversaries, family observances, and returned it to the drawer each time." "And the drawer was kept locked?" "Always. The key remains on a chain I wear about my neck." She touched her collar briefly, a gesture that confirmed the chain's presence. "I have not lent it to anyone, and I am not aware of any duplicate." Holmes inclined his head. "When did you last see the brooch in its accustomed place?" "I can be quite specific. It was the 14th of this month, a Tuesday, the anniversary of my mother's passing. I opened the drawer that morning, as I do each year on that date, to hold the brooch for a time before replacing it. It was there, precisely as it should have been." "And when did you discover its absence?" 3 days later, the 17th, a Friday. I had occasion to open the drawer for a different purpose. I keep certain letters there as well, and I noticed immediately that the brooch was gone." Holmes's fingers formed a brief steeple beneath his chin, that familiar cathedral of concentration. During those 3 intervening days, did you leave the house for any extended period? I spent one afternoon in St. Albans, attending to household purchases. I was absent, perhaps, 4 hours. And the house, during your absence? Who remained? My housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, who has been with me for 11 years, and the gardener, Mr. Phelps, who attends 3 days each week, though his work is entirely out of doors and he has no occasion to enter my private rooms. You trust them both? The question was put gently, but Mrs. Graves's response carried a quiet firmness that precluded further inquiry in that direction. Entirely, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Calloway has been my sole companion through bereavements and difficulties that would have tested the loyalty of a blood relation, and Mr. Phelps is a man of advancing years and impeccable local reputation. I would sooner suspect myself than either of them. Holmes received this declaration with a slight nod that communicated neither agreement nor skepticism, but rather the careful neutrality of a man who records all data without prejudice and reserves his conclusions for a later stage of analysis. He shifted in his chair, and I perceived in the movement a subtle recalibration, as though the questions he had prepared for one line of inquiry were being quietly reorganized to accommodate another. One further question, Mrs. Graves, before we proceed. You mentioned that you exhausted more conventional avenues of inquiry before consulting me. Might I ask what those avenues were? I made a thorough search of the house, naturally. I then consulted the local constabulary, who were courteous, but I think the word is not unkind, bewildered. A locked drawer, a missing brooch of modest value, no sign of forced entry. They recorded the matter and made sympathetic noises, and I have heard nothing further. No insurance claim? The brooch was not insured. I never thought of it as a thing to be valued in those terms. Holmes regarded her for a long, quiet moment, and I saw in his expression something I could not fully read. A complexity of attention that seemed to encompass not merely the facts she had presented, but the entirety of her presence in the room, her composure, her precision, her carefully maintained dignity. Then he sat back, his fingers still lightly touching, and the quality of his silence changed from interrogation to something closer to contemplation. What Watson sees. During the pause that followed Holmes's questioning, a pause that I recognized as one of his intervals of internal synthesis, during which the machinery of his deductive process operated at a speed and complexity that no external observer could follow, I found my own attention drawn more closely to our visitor. It is one of the less celebrated consequences of long association with Sherlock Holmes that one's habits of observation become, over time, involuntarily sharpened. I could not claim to see what Holmes saw, nor to draw from what I observed the intricate chains of inference that constituted his particular genius. But I had learned to look and to notice, and to trust the impressions that accumulated in the quieter, less analytical chambers of my mind. Mrs. Graves sat in the basket chair with the stillness of a woman who had learned that movement invites attention, and that attention, in certain circumstances, is to be avoided. Her hands rested in her lap, folded with a neatness that might have appeared natural to a casual observer, but which struck me, upon closer examination, as faintly effortful, the studied composure of fingers that would, if left to their own inclination, fidget or clench or betray some inner turbulence that their owner was determined to suppress. I had seen similar hands in my consulting room, the hands of patients who had come to discuss symptoms they feared, of women who had come to confirm conditions they suspected, of men who sat in my chair and spoke of trivial ailments while the real illness, the one they could not bring themselves to name, pressed against the inside of their ribs like a bird against a window. The mourning brooch at her throat, which I had noted upon her entrance, rewarded closer inspection. It was jet, genuine Whitby jet unless I was mistaken, with the deep, lightless black that distinguishes the real article from its French imitations, set in a silver mount of simple but pleasing design. What struck me now was not the brooch itself, but its condition. The silver was worn smooth at the edges, the pin mechanism at the back slightly loosened by years of daily fastening and unfastening, the jet surface carrying the faint, almost imperceptible patina that comes only from sustained contact with skin and fabric over a period of many years. This was not an ornament chosen for the occasion of a visit. It was an ornament that had not been removed in a very long time, a fixture, a constant, a daily declaration of a grief that had long since ceased to be an event and become an identity. Her eyes, when they moved to Holmes during the silence, carried an intensity that I found disproportionate to the matter under discussion. A missing brooch, however precious in sentimental terms, did not typically generate the quality of concentrated attention I saw in her gaze. That steady, unwavering focus that suggested not merely a client awaiting a detective's verdict, but something altogether more personal, more invested, more— I searched for the word and found it with a small shock of recognition. More purposeful. She was watching Holmes the way one watches a person one has thought about for a very long time, a person who has occupied a significant and specific place in the architecture of one's private thoughts. I became aware, as I studied her, of the particular variety of dignity she inhabited. It was not the dignity of social standing, though she clearly possessed a measure of that. It was not the brittle dignity of pride. It was the dignity of a woman who had endured, who had faced losses and difficulties that I could only partially infer from the evidence before me, and who had emerged from those ordeals not unmarked, but unbroken. Her composure a testament not to the absence of suffering, but to the discipline with which she had chosen to carry it. I have known many such women in my medical practice, women who manage grief as a private discipline, who wear their sorrow as Mrs. Graves wore her jet brooch, close to the skin and never removed, but who refuse to let it deform the architecture of their daily lives. They are, in my experience, among the strongest people alive, and among the loneliest. I felt a growing compassion for her, a response that Holmes would doubtless have cautioned me against, arguing that sympathy clouds the analytical faculties, and a corresponding sense that whatever had brought her to Baker Street this evening extended far beyond the matter of a missing cameo. Her loss, I felt with a certainty I could not logically defend, was greater than a brooch. Her purpose was deeper than its recovery. And her composure, magnificent as it was, concealed something that I could sense but not yet name, something that pressed against the elegant surface of her presentation like a hand against frosted glass, visible in outline but obscured in its particulars. Holmes stirred in his chair, and the quality of the silence changed. The detail that does not fit. Mrs. Graves, Holmes said, and though his tone remained warm, I detected in it a new precision, the subtle sharpening of a blade being drawn from its sheath with perfect control, so smoothly that the motion itself was almost invisible. I wonder if I might turn our conversation briefly to a matter that may seem tangential, but which, I assure you, has a bearing upon the thoroughness of my investigation. Mrs. Graves inclined her head with the same measured courtesy she had maintained throughout, but I noticed, and I am certain Holmes noticed, the faintest contraction at the corners of her eyes, a micro-expression so brief that it might have been a trick of the firelight had I not been watching for precisely such involuntary disclosures. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Your traveling case," Holmes said, gesturing with a languid motion toward the leather bag at her feet. "It is a handsome piece, Connolly leather, I believe, of a quality consistent with the general standard of your attire. But I observe that the handle bears a particular pattern of wear on the left side that suggests habitual carrying over a distance somewhat greater than, say, the walk from a cab to a front door. The leather is stressed along the inner grip in a manner consistent with sustained weight over a prolonged period. A railway journey, perhaps, involving at least one change of platform. and the left corner of the case shows a fresh scuff of the kind that is acquired, in my experience, almost exclusively from the luggage racks of Great Northern Railway carriages, whose dimensions are slightly narrower than those of other lines, and which tend to abrade the corners of bags placed in them with a distinctive pattern. He paused, and the pause was itself a question. You traveled today from somewhere considerably north of Hertfordshire, Mrs. Graves. The Great Northern Line does not serve St. Albans directly. It serves, among other destinations, the towns and cities of the East Midlands and Yorkshire. I wonder whether you might have begun your journey somewhat farther from London than your Hertfordshire address would suggest. The silence that followed was brief, perhaps 2 seconds. But in that silence I observed something I had not yet seen in Mrs. Graves's presentation, a moment of recalibration. It was extraordinarily subtle. Her expression did not change in any way that a casual observer would have detected. Her posture remained composed, her hands still. But there was, in the quality of her stillness, a shift, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a woman who has encountered an unexpected obstacle in a carefully planned route and is determining with great speed and discipline how to navigate around it. You are very observant, Mr. Holmes, she said, and her voice was steady, but I could not be certain, but I thought that it was steady in a different way than before, the steadiness not of natural calm, but of conscious control. I did, in fact, spend the previous evening with a cousin in Nottinghamshire before continuing to London this morning. I did not mention it because it seemed irrelevant to the matter at hand. Naturally, Holmes said, and his tone was so perfectly agreeable, so entirely devoid of challenge, that only someone who knew him as well as I did would have detected the thread of analytical satisfaction running beneath it. He had tested a seam in her account and found it, if not open, then not quite as firmly stitched as the rest. Family connections are a great comfort, particularly in times of distress. He allowed the moment to pass, deliberately, I thought, choosing not to press an advantage, but to note its existence and move on, and redirected the conversation with the apparent spontaneity that was, in fact, one of his most carefully cultivated interview techniques. I hope you will not find the question intrusive, Mrs. Graves, but it would assist me greatly to understand something of your circumstances more generally. You mentioned that the brooch was your grandmother's, and that it has passed through 3 generations. Might I ask about your family, and, if you will permit it, about your late husband? The domestic context of a disappearance is often as illuminating as the physical evidence. Mrs. Graves received the question with a composure that, to my newly attentive eye, carried the faintest quality of rehearsal, not the spontaneous openness of a person recounting their life, but the measured fluency of someone delivering an account they have prepared and refined. My husband Arthur died 5 years ago, she said. A wasting illness. The doctors were never entirely certain of its precise nature, but the effect was gradual and— She paused, and here the emotion was undeniably genuine, breaking through the careful surface like water through a crack in stone. It was a protracted decline. 18 months from the first symptoms to the end, I nursed him at home, with Mrs. Calloway's help. I am sorry, Holmes said, and the simplicity of the words, unadorned, unelaborated, spoken with a directness that I rarely heard from him, seemed to reach her more effectively than any extended expression of sympathy could have done. Thank you, she said, and recovered herself with a discipline that I found both admirable and faintly troubling. The crack sealed. The surface was smooth once more. Arthur was a good man, a quiet man. We had 12 years together, and I consider myself fortunate for every one of them. Holmes nodded slowly, and I saw in his expression the particular quality of attention that indicated not the conclusion of an inquiry, but a deepening of it, as though her answer, perfectly adequate on its surface, had confirmed a suspicion he was not yet ready to articulate. Holmes rose from his chair with the smooth, unhurried motion, that characterized his movements when he had reached a decision and wished to communicate it without ceremony. He crossed to the mantelpiece, adjusted the position of a letter tucked beneath the clock, a habitual, meaningless gesture that served, I had long suspected, no purpose other than to give his hand something to do while his mind completed its work, and turned back to Mrs. Graves with an expression of gracious resolution. "Mrs. Graves, I am happy to take the matter of your brooch under my consideration," he said, and his voice carried the warm, professional certainty that I had heard reassure 100 anxious clients. "It is the kind of case that rewards careful thought rather than hasty action, and I should like the evening to reflect upon what you have told me before I determine the most promising avenue of inquiry. Might I ask you to return tomorrow afternoon? Shall we say 3 o'clock? At which time I hope to have something more definite to offer you." Mrs. Graves agreed with a readiness that I perceived as carefully managed, not the eager relief of a client assured of help, but the controlled acknowledgement of a woman whose plan, whatever it was, had reached the end of its first stage and could now proceed to the second. She rose from the basket chair with the same measured grace with which she had occupied it, collected her traveling case from the floor beside her, and here I noted with a small inward start the particular care with which she lifted it, adjusting her grip on the handle in a way that suggested the bag's contents required more careful management than a change of clothes and a railway timetable would demand, and extended her hand to Holmes with a composure that admitted no tremor. "You are very kind, Mr. Holmes. I shall return at 3 precisely." Holmes took her hand and held it for a moment, a fraction longer, I thought, than strict social convention required, and inclined his head with a courtesy that was, to all appearances, perfectly genuine. "It has been a pleasure, Mrs. Graves. Watson, would you be good enough to see our visitor to the door?" I accompanied Mrs. Graves down the staircase, exchanging the small, conventional pleasantries that attend a guest's departure. The weather, the availability of cabs at this hour, the hope that her journey home would be comfortable. She responded with unfailing politeness, but I was conscious as I held the front door open for her and watched her step into the October evening of a curious sense of incompleteness, as though the conversation we had just concluded was not a conversation at all, but a performance, exquisitely executed, but fundamentally separate from the real business that had brought her to our door. The night air entered the hallway as she departed, cool, damp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke, and I stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her figure recede along Baker Street with that same measured, purposeful tread I had heard ascending our staircase an hour before. A cab stood waiting at the corner. She had arranged it in advance, I realized, which spoke of a woman who planned her movements with precision, and she entered it without looking back. I closed the door and climbed the stairs with a heaviness of thought that surprised me. The sitting room, when I re-entered it, felt changed, not in any physical particular, but in its atmosphere, as though the air itself retained the impression of a presence now departed. The teacups remained on the tray. The fire had burned lower. The chair where Mrs. Graves had sat still held the faint indentation of her occupancy. Holmes stood at the window, looking down at the street below, though the cab had already turned the corner, and there was nothing to see but the empty pavement and the slow drift of leaves beneath the gaslight. When he turned to face me, his expression was not the one I expected. I had anticipated the sharp, bright alertness that a new puzzle typically kindled in him, that electric quality of intellectual engagement that transformed his features and animated his movements and made him, for all his gaunt austerity, the most vital person in any room he occupied. What I saw instead was gravity, a quiet, deep, considered seriousness that I associated not with the thrill of a new case, but with the weight of a conclusion already reached and found troubling. "Holmes?" I said, and the single word carried all the questions I did not yet know how to formulate. He moved away from the window, settled into his chair, and regarded me with an expression that combined in that way unique to him, the precision of the analyst with something that I could only describe as sorrow. "Watson," he said very quietly, "the matter of the brooch is entirely fictitious. Mrs. Graves has not come to Baker Street to recover a lost heirloom. She has come for a reason she has taken considerable care to conceal, and I am not yet certain, though I have my suspicions, what that reason is. But I am certain of this. Whatever brought that woman to our door tonight, it was not sentiment for a cameo of Persephone." The fire shifted in the grate. The clock marked the silence, and I sat in my chair, the warmth of the room suddenly insufficient against the chill of what Holmes had just said, and waited for him to tell me what he had seen that I had not. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Grief. Holmes did not speak immediately. He reached for his pipe, not the clay he favored for disputatious arguments, nor the cherry wood of contemplative evenings, but the old briar he reserved for matters of genuine consequence, and filled it with a deliberation that told me he was organizing not merely his tobacco but his thoughts. The match flared, caught, and was extinguished with a single precise shake. The first curl of smoke rose between us like a question made visible, and in the brief ritual of its preparation, I recognized Holmes's method of composing himself for a disclosure he did not make lightly. "Let us begin," he said, "with the things I observed and their most probable interpretations, and let us proceed with the acknowledgement that what I am about to tell you is, in certain respects, more disturbing than the usual run of our consultations." I settled deeper into my chair, recognizing in his preamble the particular gravity that preceded revelations of a personal, rather than merely professional nature. First, her mourning attire. "You will have noted, Watson, that Mrs. Graves wears the quiet mourning of a woman well past the conventional period of bereavement for a husband lost 5 years ago. In itself, this is not unusual. Many women of a certain temperament maintain their blacks long after society has released them from the obligation. But observe the condition of the garments. They are immaculately maintained but not new. The fabric at the cuffs shows the particular luster that comes from years of careful pressing. The jet brooch at her throat, and here I direct your attention to a detail I suspect you noticed but did not follow to its conclusion, is worn smooth on its right edge, precisely where the thumb would rest if one habitually touched it, as a person touches a rosary or a talisman. This is not the mourning of 5 years, Watson. This is the mourning of a lifetime. Mrs. Graves has been in black far longer than Arthur Graves has been in his grave. I considered this, and found it both persuasive and troubling. You believe she mourns someone other than her husband? I believe she mourns someone in addition to her husband, and that the earlier loss is the one that defines her. But let us continue. He drew on his pipe and released the smoke in a slow, controlled stream. Second, her knowledge of this room. Did you observe how she moved to the basket chair? I indicated it, certainly, but she had already begun to turn in its direction before my gesture was complete. She knew where it was. She knew the geography of this sitting room with a familiarity that a first-time visitor should not possess, unless she has made a particular study of these premises in advance through published descriptions or personal reconnaissance. My published accounts do describe the room, I offered. They do, and a devoted reader might well construct a mental map from your descriptions. But there is a difference, Watson, between literary familiarity and spatial confidence. Mrs. Graves moved through this room the way one moves through a space one has physically inhabited, however briefly. I would wager, and I do not wager on insufficient data, that she has been in Baker Street before tonight, though not in this room. She has stood on the pavement outside, studied the windows, counted the steps, prepared herself with a thoroughness that exceeds anything a missing brooch could justify. The fire crackled softly, and I felt the warmth of the room pressed against a growing internal chill. Third, and most significantly, her traveling case. Holmes paused here, and the pause carried a weight that prepared me for what followed. When she adjusted it beside her chair, the case shifted in a manner inconsistent with the weight distribution of clothing and personal effects. There was a density to the lower left portion, a concentrated mass, compact and rigid, that altered the bag's center of gravity in a way I have observed before, Watson, in circumstances considerably less genteel than a consultation about a missing brooch. He met my eyes, and I saw in his gaze the absolute certainty of a man who has measured what he has seen against every alternative explanation and found only one that survives. Mrs. Graves carried a pistol in that bag. Small caliber, I should think, based on the weight distribution. Probably a revolver of an older make. The mass was concentrated rather than distributed, suggesting a solid frame rather than a modern design. She kept it close to her left hand throughout the visit. She is, I believe, left-handed, though she disguises this with the practiced ease of a woman raised in a generation that discouraged the tendency. The room was very quiet. The clock ticked, the fire murmured, and between us, in the warm, lamplit space that had held so many revelations, the shape of something dark and desperate began to assume a form I was only now beginning to comprehend. "Holmes," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. "Are you telling me that woman came here to harm you?" He held my gaze. "I am telling you, Watson, that I believe she came here to kill me." The name behind the name. I will confess that my immediate response was not the analytical clarity that Holmes's revelation demanded, but something far more primitive, a surge of protective alarm that tightened my chest and brought me half out of my chair before Holmes's raised hand and calm expression arrested the motion. He had anticipated my reaction, as he anticipated most things, and his response to it was characteristically measured. A slight shake of the head, a gesture toward my vacated seat, and a tone of voice that combined authority with reassurance, in proportions calibrated to settle precisely the kind of agitation I was experiencing. "Sit down, old friend. The danger, such as it was, has departed in a cab, and we have until 3 o'clock tomorrow to prepare our response. What I need from you now is not alarm, but attention." I sat. The chair received me, and I drew a breath that I hoped was less audible than it felt. "The question you are asking," Holmes continued, his pipe drawing evenly, his voice as steady as the clock, "is why, and it is the correct question. A woman of Mrs. Graves's evident education, composure, and social standing does not arm herself and travel to London to commit murder without a reason she considers not merely sufficient, but righteous. She is not a criminal in any conventional sense. She is, if I am not mistaken, a woman in the grip of a conviction so absolute that it has assumed, for her, the force of moral imperative." "But what conviction? What possible grievance could she hold against you?" "That is where the name becomes significant. Graves is her married name, her second married name to be precise. Arthur Graves, the quiet, good man she described with such genuine feeling, was her second husband. But it is her first marriage that concerns us, and the name she bore before she became Mrs. Graves." Holmes rose and moved to the shelves where he maintained his indexed records. Those voluminous files, cross-referenced with a meticulousness that would have done credit to the British Museum's cataloging department, in which he preserved the details of every case, every client, every criminal, and every peripheral figure who had passed through his professional life. He did not search long. His hand went to a particular volume with the confidence of a man who had already identified what he sought before he left his chair, confirming my suspicion that his deductions regarding Mrs. Graves were not freshly made in the moment of disclosure, but had been developing throughout her visit, assembled silently behind the courteous mask of his attention. He withdrew a slim folder, returned to his chair, and opened it upon his knee. Her maiden name was Ashford, Eleanor Ashford. She married, at the age of 22, a young solicitor named Cedric Ashford, no relation. The shared surname was a coincidence that I recall struck me as mildly notable at the time. Cedric Ashford. He looked at me, and I searched my memory with the earnest but ultimately unsuccessful effort of a man who has been present for too many of Holmes's cases to retain the details of each. I confess the name does not immediately. 7 years ago, Holmes said quietly. The Cresswell Trust matter. I was engaged by the directors of a charitable trust, the Cresswell Trust, endowed for the maintenance of a children's convalescent hospital in Surrey, to investigate irregularities in the trust's accounts. The investigation led me to the trust's solicitor, a young man of apparently excellent character and promising career, who had been systematically diverting funds from the trust over a period of 18 months. The memory returned now, faintly, as memories do when they belong to a period one has not had occasion to revisit. I recalled the case as one of Holmes's more methodical investigations, painstaking, document-heavy, lacking the dramatic confrontations that tended to fix themselves more vividly in my recollection. Cedric Ashford, I said. Cedric Ashford. The evidence was comprehensive and unambiguous. He had embezzled in excess of £2,000 from a fund designated for the care of sick children. I presented my findings to the directors, who referred the matter to the police. Ashford was arrested, tried, and convicted. He received a sentence of 3 years' imprisonment. Holmes closed the folder with a care that seemed less about the physical document than about the weight of what it represented. I recall the case without particular satisfaction, Watson. It was thorough. It was correct, and I moved on from it, as one does, to the next matter that required my attention. It did not occur to me then, and I say this with the full awareness of what it reveals about the limitations of my perspective, to consider what happened to the young man's wife. The fire had burned low during this account, and neither of us had thought to tend it. The sitting room, still warm, had taken on the quality of a confessional, intimate, shadowed, suited to the disclosure of truths that the full light of day might render too stark to bear. What happened to Cedric Ashford? What I am about to relate, Holmes said, setting aside his pipe with the deliberate care of a man who wished his hands to be still and his words to carry their full, unadorned weight. I have assembled from several sources, public records, the archives of the relevant court, and certain discreet inquiries I initiated this afternoon, in the interval between Mrs. Graves's departure and the present moment, when I first began to suspect the connection. I noted this with a familiar mixture of admiration and mild exasperation. Holmes had, it seemed, already dispatched telegrams or consulted his network of informants during the brief period when I believed he had been sitting quietly by the fire. It was characteristic of him, that capacity to act with invisible efficiency while presenting to the world, and even to me, the appearance of repose. Cedric Ashford entered Pentonville Prison in the spring of 1889, Holmes began, his voice adopting the measured, even cadence he employed when relating facts he wished me to receive without editorial coloring. He was 29 years old, in good physical health, and possessed of a temperament that his associates described as sensitive, earnest, and, a word that recurred in several accounts, hopeful. He was not, by any credible measure, a hardened criminal. The embezzlement, as I reconstructed it at the time, appeared to have begun as a single, panicked misappropriation to cover a personal debt, a debt incurred through no vice more dramatic than an ill-judged investment in a mining concern, and escalated through the terrible, compounding logic that so often transforms a single mistake into a sustained deception. Each theft necessitated the next. Each falsified entry demanded a more elaborate falsification to conceal it. By the time I was engaged to examine the accounts, the architecture of his fraud had grown so complex that it practically announced itself to any investigator of moderate competence. Holmes paused, and I saw in his expression something I had rarely witnessed, a quality of retrospective attention, as though he were examining not merely the facts of the case, but his own conduct within it, holding his past self up to a light that the passage of 7 years had rendered both clearer and less forgiving. He served his 3 years, Holmes continued, the full term, without remission. Prison, for a man of Ashford's temperament, was, I do not think I exaggerate, a species of slow destruction. He was not built for it. The coarseness, the confinement, the relentless erasure of privacy and dignity that constitutes the daily texture of incarceration. These things, which a harder man might have endured and emerged from relatively intact, operated upon Cedric Ashford with a corrosive thoroughness that I can only describe as systematic. His wife, I said, thinking of Mrs. Graves, of Eleanor, and the mourning she wore like armor. She stood by him? She did. Throughout the trial, throughout the sentence, she attended every court appearance. She visited the prison with a regularity that the records confirm bordered on the devotional. And when he emerged in the spring of 1892, she was there to receive him. Holmes's voice, always controlled, had acquired a quietness that told me more about his internal state than any display of emotion could have done. But the man she received was not the man she had married. The conviction had severed Ashford from his profession. He was struck from the rolls, naturally, and no solicitor's firm would touch him thereafter. His social standing, such as it was, evaporated entirely. Friends withdrew. Family connections, never robust, dissolved under the pressure of public disgrace. He and Eleanor found themselves in reduced circumstances, profoundly reduced, living in lodgings in Holloway, subsisting on what little Eleanor could earn through needlework and occasional teaching. The room was very still. The fire had subsided to a deep, orange glow that cast long shadows across the carpet and up the walls, and neither Holmes nor I moved to revive it. There are moments when physical comfort seems an impertinence in the face of what is being described, and this was such a moment. The decline was not swift, Holmes said. It was gradual, which is, I think, the crueler form. Ashford sought employment and was refused. He wrote letters and received no replies. He began to drink, moderately at first, then less so. His health, undermined by 3 years of prison diet and prison air, deteriorated. The cough that had troubled him in Pentonville became chronic, then severe. Eleanor nursed him as she would later nurse Arthur Graves, with that same fierce, quiet, inexhaustible devotion that I observed in her bearing tonight. When did he die? In the winter of 1893, 18 months after his release. The certificate records the cause as pneumonia, and pneumonia it was in the narrowest clinical sense. But pneumonia, Watson, as you know better than most, is often less a disease than an opportunity, the final insult to a body already weakened by deprivation, despair, and the slow, systematic withdrawal of every reason to resist it. Holmes fell silent, and in the silence I heard the full, terrible weight of what he had told me, not as a case summary, not as a sequence of facts, but as a human life, a young man's single, foolish mistake, the machinery of justice that processed him with impersonal efficiency, the woman who loved him and could not save him, and the long, gray aftermath of a destruction that no court had sentenced, but that the sentence had made inevitable. She married Arthur Graves 2 years later, Holmes added, more quietly still. A good man by her account, and I have no reason to doubt it. But the mourning she wears, Watson, the deep, enduring, unrelinquished mourning that has become the very fabric of her identity, that mourning is not for Arthur Graves, it is for Cedric Ashford. And in her understanding, in the narrative she has constructed to make sense of an unbearable loss, the man responsible for Cedric's destruction is not the system that convicted him, nor the circumstances that broke him, nor even Cedric himself for the choices that began it all. The man responsible, in Eleanor Ashford's long and unrelenting grief, is the detective who uncovered the truth and set the machinery in motion. He met my eyes. The man responsible, Watson, is me. The question that formed in my mind was one I almost hesitated to ask, not from any fear of Holmes's response, but from a reluctance to press upon what I sensed was a bruise of unusual depth and tenderness in a man I had long considered, if not impervious to such injuries, then extraordinarily skilled at concealing them. But the question demanded asking, and Holmes, I knew, would have thought less of me for withholding it. "Holmes," I said, choosing my words with a care that the moment seemed to require, "do you believe your investigation was just? That your findings were correct?" He did not answer immediately, and the pause itself was significant. Holmes, in the ordinary course of his work, responded to questions about the accuracy of his deductions with an immediacy that bordered on the reflexive, not from arrogance, though arrogance was never entirely absent from his intellectual makeup, but from the genuine, deeply held conviction that facts, properly observed and logically assembled, admitted no ambiguity. To see him hesitate, to see him turn a question over in his mind, as one turns a stone, examining its underside, was to witness something I had observed perhaps a half-dozen times in all our years of association. "The facts were incontrovertible," he said at last, and his voice carried the absolute certainty I expected, but carried it, I thought, as a man carries a heavy object, with effort and with a consciousness of its weight. Cedric Ashford embezzled in excess of £2,000 from a charitable trust established for the care of sick children. The evidence was comprehensive, methodically gathered, and independently verifiable. There was no question of mistaken identity, coerced confession, or circumstantial misinterpretation. He did what the evidence said he did. My investigation was thorough, my conclusions sound, and my testimony at trial accurate in every particular. "Then you have nothing to reproach yourself for." Holmes regarded me with an expression I found difficult to read, not because it was opaque, but because it contained more than one thing simultaneously, layers of thought and feeling that overlapped like the colors in that medieval glass he had been reading about an hour and a lifetime ago. "I have nothing to reproach myself for in the matter of the investigation," he said, and the precision of the qualification was itself a revelation. "The case was conducted correctly. Justice, in its procedural sense, was served. The trust recovered a portion of its funds. The Children's Hospital continued to operate. These are outcomes I do not regret and would not alter." He paused again, and the fire, nearly extinguished now, reduced to a constellation of embers that pulsed faintly in the grate like the last visible stars before dawn, cast his features in a light that emphasized their angular severity, while softening, paradoxically, the eyes. "But I have spent the better part of 3 decades in the service of truth, Watson, and I have learned, slowly, imperfectly, against the grain of my own temperament, that being right is not the same as being complete. I was right about Cedric Ashford. I was right about the evidence, the embezzlement, the breach of trust, but I gave no thought, none whatever, to what would happen to the young man's wife when the machinery I had set in motion completed its work. I did not consider her. She was not part of the equation. She was not a variable in my analysis. She was, to the detective who assembled the case, invisible. The word landed in the room with a weight that seemed disproportionate to its 4 syllables, and I understood in that moment that Holmes was not confessing to an error of method, but to something more fundamental, a limitation not of intellect, but of perspective, a narrowness of vision that his extraordinary gifts had both enabled and concealed. He had seen everything that could be deduced. He had missed everything that could only be felt. "I do not traffic in guilt, Watson," he said, and there was in the statement a firmness that I recognized as genuine rather than defensive. "Guilt is a corrosive and largely unproductive emotion, and I have no patience with those who cultivate it as a substitute for constructive action. But I am capable of recognition. I recognize that the system I serve, the system of evidence and prosecution and punishment, operates with a necessary but sometimes terrible incompleteness. It sees the crime. It does not always see the life. And in the case of Cedric Ashford, I was the instrument of that system, and I operated with its limitations as my own. He straightened in his chair, a physical gesture that I read as the reassertion of resolve over reflection, and when he spoke again, his voice had recovered something of its customary precision. Mrs. Graves does not know any of this, of course. She knows only what her grief has told her, that I destroyed Cedric, and that the destruction was careless and complete. Her narrative is wrong in its particulars, but not, I confess, entirely wrong in its outline. And it is that partial truth, far more dangerous than a complete falsehood, that has brought her to Baker Street with a revolver in her bag and a conviction in her heart that justice requires my death. The plan for tomorrow. The embers in the grate had faded to a deep, sullen red, and I rose to rebuild the fire, not from any conscious decision, but from the instinct, deeply rooted in my nature, to respond to gravity with practical action. The coal scuttle was beside the fender where Mrs. Hudson always left it, and the familiar motions of tending the fire, the selection of the coals, the careful placement, the adjustment of the draft, served as a kind of counterweight to the extraordinary nature of what Holmes had disclosed. There is a comfort in tending to physical necessities at moments of emotional extremity, a reassurance that the basic architecture of ordinary life remains intact even when the structures of understanding have been shaken. The fresh coals caught, and the fire reasserted itself with a quiet authority that gradually reclaimed the shadows from the corners of the room. I returned to my chair and found Holmes watching me with an expression that combined, in proportions I could not have quantified, affection and amusement, and the particular regard he reserved for those moments when my character, steady, practical, unyielding in its loyalty, served a function his own could not. "Thank you, Watson," he said, and the words encompassed considerably more than the fire. "What do you intend to do?" I asked, because the question was the only one that mattered now, and because I knew that Holmes, having completed his analysis of the situation, would already have formulated his response with the same precision he brought to every problem that engaged his faculties. "When Mrs. Graves returns tomorrow at 3, Holmes said, "I do not intend to confront her with her deception. I do not intend to reveal that I have identified the weapon in her bag, and I most emphatically do not intend to have her arrested." "Holmes, hear me, Watson." His voice was gentle but carried the particular authority that precluded interruption. "Consider what we know. Mrs. Graves is not a criminal. She is a woman who has spent 7 years constructing a narrative of blame that has given shape and direction to a grief that might otherwise have consumed her entirely. The narrative is wrong, not in its broadest strokes, perhaps, but in its conclusions and its prescribed remedy. She believes that I destroyed Cedric carelessly, indifferently, without thought or consequence. She believes that the world failed to hold me accountable, and she has come to Baker Street to impose the accountability that the world withheld. He leaned forward, and the firelight caught his features with a clarity that seemed almost sculptural. The most natural response, the response that the law would sanction and that prudence would recommend, is to disarm her, expose her, and deliver her to the authorities. She would be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, or at the very least with carrying a concealed weapon with intent. She would be tried, convicted, and imprisoned. And the cycle that began with Cedric Ashford's incarceration would complete itself with a terrible symmetry. Another life destroyed by the machinery of justice. Another human being processed and discarded by a system that sees the act, but not the anguish that produced it. "Then what?" I asked, though I was beginning, with the slow comprehension of a man who has spent years absorbing another man's methods, to perceive the outline of his intention. "I will tell her the truth," Holmes said simply. "The full truth, including elements of Cedric's case that she may not know, that she almost certainly does not know. And I will do so not from behind the shield of professional authority, but as one human being speaking to another about a shared history and its consequences. I considered this, The physician in me saw the wisdom of it. The recognition that Mrs. Graves's plan was a symptom rather than a disease, and that treating the symptom while leaving the underlying condition unaddressed would achieve nothing of lasting value. The soldier in me, for the old instincts never fully retire, saw the risk. A woman with a revolver, driven by years of compacted grief, confronted with truths that might shatter rather than heal. "I will be present," I said, and it was not a question. "I would not have it otherwise," Holmes replied, and something in his tone, a warmth, a gratitude, a recognition of the particular form of courage that consists not in facing danger alone, but in standing beside someone who faces it, settled between us like a hand clasp. The fire burned. The clock struck 10. Outside, the October wind had risen, carrying with it the sound of leaves in motion, that dry, restless whisper that is autumn's constant murmured commentary on the passage of all things. Holmes reached for his monograph on medieval glass, opened it to the page he had marked, and resumed his reading with an apparent calm that I recognized, after all our years together, as the deepest form of preparation, the deliberate cultivation of stillness before the storm. I did not read. I sat in my chair and watched the fire, and thought about Eleanor Ashford, Eleanor Graves, traveling through the dark toward a home that held only her housekeeper and her memories, and the fixed, consuming certainty that had brought her to our door. I wondered what she was thinking. I wondered if she would sleep. And I wondered whether Holmes was right, whether truth, offered with sufficient care, could dismantle a structure that grief had spent 7 years building, or whether some architectures of pain are so deeply founded that no force on earth, however compassionate, can bring them down without destroying the person who inhabits them. The night deepened around us, and Baker Street settled into the particular silence of the small hours, and neither of us spoke again before retiring. Chapter 4. The Hour of Truth. I slept poorly and woke to the kind of morning that October produces when it wishes to remind London of the winter that waits in the wings. A thin, persistent mist that clung to the rooftops and softened the outlines of the buildings across the street into watercolor approximations of themselves. The world beyond our windows appeared provisional, as though the city had not yet fully committed to existing, and might, given sufficient discouragement, dissolve back into the gray from which it had reluctantly materialized. I washed, dressed, and descended to find Holmes already at the breakfast table, a circumstance that on any ordinary morning would have suggested either an early case or insomnia. The shadows beneath his eyes confirmed the latter. He had not slept well, and he had made no effort to disguise the fact, which was itself telling. Holmes was ordinarily meticulous in maintaining the appearance of inexhaustible vitality, particularly on days when his faculties would be required at their sharpest. That he permitted me to see his fatigue was, I understood, an act of trust, an acknowledgement that the day ahead was not one he wished to face behind the mask of professional invulnerability. "Good morning, Watson," he said, and gestured toward the covered dishes, with a civility that carried no commentary on the hour of my arrival or the evident signs of my own restless night. Mrs. Hudson had provided her usual thorough breakfast: eggs, toast, kedgeree, a pot of coffee strong enough to serve as a restorative in its own right, and I applied myself to it with the methodical appetite of a man who has learned, through military service and medical practice alike, that one eats when one can, regardless of one's emotional condition. Holmes ate as well, which I found more reassuring than I might have expected. He selected toast, marmalade, and coffee, and consumed them with a quiet concentration that suggested not indifference to the coming afternoon, but a deliberate compartmentalization, the disciplined separation of the present moment's necessities from the future moment's demands. We spoke of other things. Holmes remarked upon an article in the morning paper concerning the restoration of a Wren church in the city. I mentioned a letter I had received from an old army colleague now living in Devon. We discussed the marmalade, a new variety Mrs. Hudson had procured, darker and more bittersweet than her usual selection. With a seriousness that might have struck an outside observer as absurd, but which we both understood as the particular language of two men sustaining each other through an interval of waiting. Mrs. Hudson moved through the rooms below us with her customary morning rhythms, the clink of crockery, the measured tread of her footsteps, the opening and closing of the street door as the day's deliveries arrived. These sounds, so familiar as to be nearly subliminal, constituted a kind of domestic music that had underscored our lives at Baker Street for years, and I found myself listening to them with a heightened awareness, as one listens to bird song on a morning one suspects may be significant. The ordinary, I reflected, is never more precious than when it is about to be interrupted. Holmes checked his watch at intervals he thought I did not notice. The morning advanced with the unhurried inevitability that characterizes all periods of anticipation, each hour simultaneously too slow and too swift, and by noon the mist had thinned sufficiently to admit a pale, diffuse light that fell through our windows with the tentative quality of a visitor unsure of its welcome. The return of Mrs. Graves. At precisely 3 o'clock, the mantel clock had not yet completed its third stroke. Mrs. Hudson's knock sounded upon the sitting-room door, and the echo of the previous evening's arrival was so exact that I experienced a momentary disorientation, as though time had folded upon itself, and the intervening hours had been merely imagined. The same knock, the same announcement, the same measured footsteps ascending the 17 stairs. The script of the evening before was being performed again, line for line, and the knowledge that I now possessed, the knowledge of what those footsteps carried, of what purpose moved behind that composed exterior, transformed the familiar into something charged with a significance I had to work to contain. She entered wearing the same dark morning dress, carrying the same leather traveling case. The jet brooch gleamed at her throat. Her gloves were buttoned with the same meticulous precision. If anything had changed in her presentation, it was something so subtle that I might have imagined it. A faint deepening of the shadows beneath her eyes, perhaps, or a minute tightening of the muscles around her mouth that suggested a night no more restful than our own. Holmes rose to greet her with the same gracious courtesy he had extended the previous evening, and I watched the exchange of pleasantries with the peculiar double vision of a man who sees both the surface and the structure simultaneously. The social ritual performed with impeccable fidelity by two people who both knew and both knew the other knew, though only one yet realized the extent of the mutual awareness. Holmes offered the basket chair. Mrs. Graves accepted it. Tea was poured, the lamp was adjusted. The fire, which I had built up generously in the early afternoon, cast its steady warmth across the three of us, and for a suspended moment the sitting room at 221B Baker Street held its breath. I was seated in my customary chair, positioned, by Holmes's earlier casual suggestion, slightly closer to Mrs. Graves than my usual placement. I understood the strategic purpose of this adjustment without Holmes having to articulate it. In the event that the afternoon took a direction we could not predict, my proximity to the client would allow me to act quickly. The old service revolver was in the drawer of my writing desk, within reach, but not in hand. Holmes had been specific on this point. No visible weapons, no posture of defense. We would meet her as we had met her the evening before, as a detective and his friend receiving a client in their home. Mrs. Graves settled her traveling case beside her chair. Left hand, same position, same careful, deliberate grip. Holmes allowed the silence to extend a moment longer than convention required. A silence that served, I understood, as both preparation and invitation, creating a space in which the afternoon's true conversation might begin. Then he set down his teacup with a small, precise sound that I had heard 1,000 times, and that seemed, on this occasion, to carry the weight of a declaration. "Mrs. Graves," he said, and his voice was quiet and warm and carried not the professional polish of a consulting detective, but the simple, undefended directness of a man about to speak the truth. Before we discuss the matter of the brooch, I wonder if I might speak with you about something else. Something I believe is closer to the true purpose of your visit." She did not move. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her eyes, fixed upon Holmes, held a stillness that was not calm, but concentrated. The stillness of a person who has been preparing for a moment and finds, now that it has arrived, that preparation and reality are very different things. "I should like," Holmes said gently, "to speak with you about Cedric Ashford." The name fell into the room like a stone into deep water, and the silence that followed it possessed a quality I have never encountered before or since, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too large for sound to contain. Watson describes silence as physical in moments of extremity, and I can confirm that this silence had weight and texture and temperature. It pressed against the walls of the sitting room like a held breath, and in it I could hear, or thought I could hear, the faint acceleration of Mrs. Graves's breathing, a sound so slight that it might have been the fire shifting in the grate or the October wind testing the window frame. She did not reach for her bag. That was the first thing I registered, and the relief that accompanied the observation was more profound than I would have wished to acknowledge. Her hands remained in her lap, folded with the same careful precision, but their quality had changed. The composure was still present, but it was no longer the composure of performance. It was the composure of a woman who has been seen through her disguise and is deciding, in real time, what remains when the disguise is removed. "How long have you known?" she asked, and her voice was steady, not the rehearsed steadiness of the previous evening, but something raw and more genuine. The steadiness of a person who has carried a secret for so long that its exposure, when it finally comes, brings not panic but a strange, exhausted clarity. "From the first evening," Holmes said, "not every particular, but the essential shape. The brooch was fiction, beautifully constructed and convincingly delivered, but fiction nonetheless. Your real purpose required a different explanation. And you did not have me arrested?" "No." "Why?" The question was simple, but the voice that asked it was not. There were layers in that single word: bewilderment, suspicion, something that might have been the first tentative stirring of a hope she was not yet ready to identify. And Holmes received them all with an attention that was, I realized, the most generous thing I had ever seen him offer another human being. The full, unhurried, undivided attention of his extraordinary mind, directed not toward solving a puzzle, but toward understanding a person. "Because I understood," he said. "Not everything. I am not so presumptuous as to claim comprehension of what you have endured, but enough to know that what brought you here was not malice. It was grief. And grief, Mrs. Graves, grief of the kind you carry, does not respond to handcuffs and courtrooms. It has already survived those things once." Something moved in her face, a shift so subtle and so swift that a lesser observer would have missed it entirely, but which I, watching with every faculty I possessed, recognized as the first fracture in a structure that had been building for 7 years. Not a collapse, not yet, but a fracture, a hairline crack in the edifice of blame and purpose that she had constructed around herself like a fortress, and through which, for the first time, something other than rage might enter. Holmes spoke then about Cedric, not as a case file, not as a name in an index. He spoke about him as a young man, talented, hopeful, fatally flawed in the particular way that combines ambition with anxiety, the desire to succeed with the fear of being found wanting. He spoke about the investigation with a candor that surprised me, the methodical examination of the accounts, the growing certainty that the irregularities were not clerical but deliberate, the moment of confirmation that was, Holmes said, never a moment of triumph, but always a moment of sobriety, because behind every proven fraud, there is a human being who chose wrongly and must now face the consequences of that choice. He spoke about the trial. He spoke about Eleanor's presence in the gallery, a detail I had not known he noticed, but which he recalled with a precision that told me it had lodged in his memory with a tenacity that surprised even him. The young wife, dressed simply, watching with an expression that combined terror and devotion in equal measure. He had seen her, he had registered her, and then he had moved on. "I did not think about what happened to you," Holmes said, and the admission, direct, unvarnished, unmitigated by excuse or justification, fell into the room with the quiet force of an apology that does not call itself by that name. "I pursued the truth. I proved the truth. And I gave no thought to the life that the truth would destroy beyond the one it was designed to hold accountable. That is not guilt, Mrs. Graves. I do not believe I was wrong to investigate, nor wrong in my conclusions, but it is a recognition, long overdue, that the truth I served was incomplete. It saw the crime. It did not see you." Mrs. Graves's hands had unclenched. She had not noticed it, I was certain of that, but her fingers, so long maintained in their posture of rigid composure, had loosened and lay open in her lap, palms upward, in the universal gesture of a person who has released something they have been holding for a very long time. The thing she never knew. Holmes paused, and in the pause I sensed the gathering of something consequential, the intake of breath before a revelation that he had been building toward, with the careful, cumulative architecture of a man who understands that certain truths must be approached gradually if they are to be received rather than merely heard. "There is something I would like to tell you, Mrs. Graves," he said, "that I have never told anyone. It does not change what happened. It does not diminish the loss you suffered or the legitimacy of the anger you have carried. But it is part of the story, a part that was never made public, and that I think you have a right to know." Mrs. Graves said nothing. Her silence was not refusal, but readiness. The silence of a woman who has spent 7 years believing she knew the complete story of her first husband's destruction and is now confronted with the possibility that her knowledge was incomplete. "After Cedric's conviction," Holmes said, "I found myself in an unusual position. The investigation was concluded. The Trust's directors were satisfied. The matter was, in every professional sense, closed. And yet I could not entirely close it in my mind. There was, and I acknowledge this with some difficulty, as it pertains to a region of my nature I do not habitually explore, there was a residue, an awareness that the outcome I had produced, however just in its legal dimension, had set in motion consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom." He rose from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, not with restlessness, but with the deliberate movement of a man who needs the physical act of standing to support the weight of what he is about to say. "I made inquiries, discreetly, through an intermediary, a solicitor of my acquaintance whose discretion I trusted absolutely. I learned that Cedric's legal debts, the costs of his defense, the fees accumulated during the proceedings, amounted to a sum that would have been crushing under any circumstances and was, given his impending imprisonment, effectively a sentence of financial ruin laid upon a foundation of personal ruin. These debts would fall inevitably upon his wife." He turned from the mantelpiece and faced Mrs. Graves directly. "I arranged, through my intermediary, for a portion of the funds recovered from the trust, funds that the directors had agreed to allocate at their discretion, to be directed toward the settlement of Cedric's most pressing legal obligations. The sum was not enormous. It did not cover everything, but it addressed the most immediate and crushing of the debts, and it was done in such a way that neither the directors nor the court nor the public were aware of my involvement." The room was absolutely still. The fire's gentle crackle seemed to come from a great distance, and the clock's ticking had receded to the periphery of awareness, as though even the mechanisms of the household recognized that this moment required their deference. "I did not do this from guilt," Holmes said, and his voice carried the precision of a man who has examined his own motives with the same rigor he applies to evidence. "I did it because it was within my power, And because the alternative, to walk away from a situation I had materially influenced without acknowledging any responsibility for its human consequences, was inconsistent with the kind of man I wished to be, whatever kind of detective I was required to be. He paused. I never spoke of it because I believed, and I continue to believe, that mercy, once advertised, ceases to be mercy and becomes self-congratulation. It was a private act, undertaken for private reasons, and I intended it to remain private for the duration of my life. Mrs. Graves sat motionless. Her face, which had maintained its extraordinary composure through revelations that would have shattered a lesser constitution, was undergoing a transformation that I can only describe as geological, slow, deep, fundamental, as though the very bedrock of her understanding were shifting beneath structures that had stood for 7 years. Her eyes, those clear gray eyes that had watched Holmes with such controlled intensity across 2 visits, were bright with a moisture she no longer attempted to suppress. I watched her hands, the hands I had studied across 2 evenings, reading in their careful stillness the discipline of a woman who had armored herself against the world with composure as her only shield. And I saw them tremble. For the first time since she had entered our sitting room, for the first time I suspected in a very long while, Eleanor Graves' hands trembled, and the trembling was not weakness, but the visible evidence of a structure beginning at last to yield. She did not speak. There were, I think, no words available to her in that moment, no formula of language adequate to the experience of discovering that the man she had come to kill had once, quietly and without expectation of recognition, extended a hand of mercy toward the very person whose destruction she held him responsible for. The contradiction was too vast, too complete, too devastating in its implications for the narrative that had sustained her through 7 years of grief and rage to be processed in the currency of speech. A tear fell, then another. She did not wipe them away. The letting go. The tears, when they came fully, were not the dramatic outpouring of a dam catastrophically breached, but the slow, steady, exhausting release of a reservoir that had been filling for 7 years and had finally, in the warmth and safety of this room, found permission to overflow. Mrs. Graves wept with the quietness of a woman who has long practice in containing her emotions, and whose body, even in the act of surrender, maintains certain habits of restraint. Her shoulders did not heave. Her breathing, though uneven, did not dissolve into sobs. The tears simply fell, tracing their paths down cheeks that had held them back for so long that their passage seemed almost ceremonial. A ritual of release performed with the same dignity that had characterized everything else about her. I reached into my breast pocket, withdrew my handkerchief, freshly laundered mercifully, and offered it to her without words. She accepted it with a nod of acknowledgement that managed even in extremity to convey gratitude, and pressed it briefly to her eyes with a gesture that was less about drying the tears than about granting herself a moment of privacy behind the small white shield of cotton. Holmes sat in his chair and did not speak. This silence was, I understood, not the analytical silence of a mind at work, but the respectful silence of a man who recognized that the most important thing happening in the room required no contribution from him, that his role, having delivered the truth that precipitated this moment, was now simply to be present, to witness, and to allow the process of recalibration to proceed at whatever pace Mrs. Graves's wounded spirit required. The fire burned. The clock ticked. The October afternoon, pressing its gray light against the windows, seemed to hold the room in a kind of temporal suspension, as though the ordinary passage of minutes had been paused to accommodate an event that operated on a different and more fundamental timescale. When Mrs. Graves spoke again, her voice had changed. The careful modulation was gone. The rehearsed fluency was gone. What remained was something stripped and plain and undefended, the voice of a woman who had set down the heaviest thing she carried and was discovering, with the disoriented wonder of the suddenly unburdened, what it felt like to stand without it. "Cedric," she said, just the name. Spoken not to Holmes, not to me, but to someone who was not in the room and had not been in any room for 7 years. It was the voice of a woman speaking to the dead, not with the formality of prayer or the anguish of fresh grief, but with the quiet, intimate familiarity of someone addressing a person they have carried in their heart for so long that the conversation between them has never truly ceased, only been conducted in silence. She said his name, and in the saying of it I heard something close, not a door, not a chapter, but something older and deeper. A question that had been open for 7 years, a question about blame and justice, and the meaning of a life cut short. And that was now, in this room, in this light, receiving if not an answer, then at least a different kind of silence. The silence not of unanswered accusation, but of acknowledged complexity, of truth received and grief permitted, and the terrible, liberating recognition that the world is more complicated than sorrow wants it to be. Holmes waited. Then, with a gentleness I had never heard from him, a gentleness that seemed to cost him something, as though it required the temporary suspension of every defense he had built around his own emotional life, he said, "The item in your bag, Mrs. Graves." She looked at him. The look held no fear, no defiance, no shame. It held something I can only describe as recognition, the recognition of one person truly seeing another, across a distance that grief and blame had made vast, but that truth, patiently and compassionately offered, had finally bridged. She reached for the traveling case. She opened it, and she withdrew the pistol. It was small, smaller than I had imagined. An old-fashioned revolver, short-barreled, with a wooden grip worn smooth by handling. It was not a weapon chosen for efficiency or stopping power. It was, I suspected, a weapon that had been in her possession for some time, perhaps Cedric's own or her father's, and it had the look of an object whose purpose had been more symbolic than practical, a physical manifestation of an intention that had sustained her through the darkest years of her grief. She placed it on the table between them. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and carried a solemnity that transformed a simple physical act into something approaching ritual. She set it down, the way one sets down a burden that has been carried so long it has become part of the body, with care and with the strange, vertiginous lightness that accompanies the discovery that one's hands, emptied of their accustomed weight, do not quite know what to do with their sudden freedom. Holmes received the weapon without judgment. He picked it up with the careful, professional handling of a man long familiar with firearms, examined it briefly. I saw him note that it was loaded, that the mechanism was old but functional, that it had been cleaned recently, and set it aside with a quietness that accorded it neither more nor less significance than it deserved. "Would you like Watson to arrange a cab?" he asked, and the question, so ordinary, so practical, so entirely appropriate to the moment, seemed to release something in Mrs. Graves that all the preceding revelations had not quite reached. She almost smiled. Not quite. But the muscles around her mouth shifted in a way that suggested the memory of smiling, the knowledge that such a thing was possible, even if the full expression was not yet available to her. "I should like to walk," she said, "if you would not mind." "I think I should like to walk for a while," Holmes nodded. I rose and opened the sitting room door for her, and she gathered her traveling case, lighter now, conspicuously lighter, and moved toward the stairs with a tread that I listened to with the same close attention I had given her arrival, the same measured steps, the same deliberate rhythm, but something had changed in the quality of the sound. A subtle difference in pressure, perhaps, or in tempo, as though the feet that descended carried a different weight than the feet that had climbed. Not lighter in any dramatic sense, but eased, perceptibly, gently, unmistakably eased. The front door opened and closed. The October air entered briefly and withdrew. And then she was gone. Out into the gray afternoon, into the mist and the leaf-scattered streets, into a life that would be different now in ways that none of us could predict, but that all of us, I think, hoped would be kinder than what had come before. Chapter 5. The Fire and the Dark. The sitting room held her absence the way a bell holds the memory of its last sounding, not in any visible particular, but in a quality of resonance that lingered in the air long after the source had ceased. The chair where she had sat retained the faint impression of her presence. The teacup she had barely touched stood on its saucer where she had placed it, a thin film forming on the surface of the cooling liquid. The small revolver lay on the side table where Holmes had set it aside, incongruous among the books and papers and the cold remains of the afternoon's tobacco, an object from a different kind of story, stranded in a room that had chosen a different ending. Holmes stood at the window, looking down at Baker Street. I did not join him. There are moments when a man's gaze through glass is directed not at the street below, but at something internal, something that the act of looking outward merely facilitates, and I recognized this as such a moment. Whatever Holmes saw as he stood there, the mist, the lamplighter beginning his rounds, the slow passage of cabs and pedestrians through the gathering dusk, served as a screen upon which he was projecting thoughts I could not share and did not presume to interrupt. I went to the fire instead. It had burned down during the long afternoon. We had neither of us thought to tend it, and the room, though not cold, had lost the enveloping warmth that had characterized the morning. The coal scuttle was where it always was. The tongs were where they always were. And the act of rebuilding the fire, that ancient elemental act of restoring warmth to a space that has grown cool, was, as it had been the previous evening, both a practical necessity and an emotional one. I was not merely building a fire. I was rebuilding the room, reasserting its character as a place of safety and warmth and familiar comfort after an afternoon that had tested those qualities to their limits. The coals caught, the flames rose, the shadows retreated to their accustomed corners, and the sitting room at 221B Baker Street began, incrementally and with the patient reliability of a place that has weathered many storms, to feel like itself again. Holmes turned from the window. His expression was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because it contained too many things at once, layered and overlapping like the colors in a deep pool. I thought I saw exhaustion and relief, and something that might have been satisfaction but was not quite that, something more sober and less certain, the expression of a man who has done what he believed to be right and is now waiting to learn whether rightness was enough. "The pistol," he said, glancing at the side table. "Yes," I said, "we should put it away." I crossed the room, picked up the revolver, noting as I did its surprising lightness, the worn smoothness of its grip, the faint scent of gun oil that told me she had cleaned it recently, prepared it, made it ready for the purpose she had carried it here to fulfill, and placed it in the deep drawer of Holmes's desk, beneath a stack of old case files where it would rest, undisturbed, until we determined what to do with it. The drawer closed with a quiet, definitive sound, and with it, something else closed, not completely, perhaps not permanently, but sufficiently for the evening to begin its work of restoration. Holmes settled into his chair. I settled into mine, and the fire burned between us as it had burned on 1,000 evenings before, and would burn, I hoped, on 1,000 evenings yet to come. What Holmes carried. For a time, neither of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It rarely was between us after so many years, but it carried a particular density, as though the afternoon's events had saturated the air with a substance that required time to dissipate. The fire crackled and settled. The clock measured the minutes with its customary patience. Outside, the October evening completed its occupation of the city, and the windows transitioned fully from transparency to reflection, showing us the lamplit interior of our own room like a portrait in a dark frame. It was Holmes who broke the silence, and he did so in a manner that told me the words had been forming for some time, assembling themselves in the deeper chambers of his mind, while his conscious attention occupied itself with the fire and the window and the slow return of ordinary feeling. "I have thought about Cedric Ashford more than you might suppose, Watson," he said, and his voice carried the particular quietness he adopted when venturing into emotional territory, not reluctant exactly, but careful, the way a man is careful when walking on ground he knows to be uncertain. Not frequently, not obsessively, but at intervals, irregular, unpredictable. His name has surfaced in my thoughts with a persistence that I have never quite been able to account for through rational means. He paused, and I waited, understanding that this was not a disclosure he was accustomed to making, and that the pace of it must be his to determine. "I have handled hundreds of cases, thousands if one counts the minor consultations and the matters resolved by correspondence. The vast majority leave no residue. They are solved, filed, and forgotten, not through callousness, but through the simple necessity of a mind that must remain available for the next problem. To accumulate the emotional weight of every case would be to render oneself incapable of functioning. A certain professional detachment is not merely useful, it is essential." "I have always understood that," I said. "I know you have. And I know that you have sometimes wondered, though you have been too tactful to ask, whether that detachment constitutes a genuine limitation of feeling or merely the appearance of one." I said nothing because he was right. I had wondered. For years I had wondered. "The honest answer," Holmes said, "is that I do not entirely know. The machinery of my mind is calibrated for analysis. I observe, I deduce, I conclude. These operations require a certain distance from the emotional dimensions of the data I process, and I have cultivated that distance with deliberate and sustained effort since long before you and I met. Whether the distance has, over time, become genuine, whether the capacity for feeling has atrophied through disuse, or whether it merely sleeps, emerging occasionally in forms I do not always recognize. This is a question I cannot answer with the confidence I bring to questions of evidence and logic." He turned his gaze from the fire to me, and in his eyes I saw something I had seen only rarely in all our years of friendship. A vulnerability that was not weakness but honesty, the willingness to be seen in a condition of uncertainty by someone he trusted not to exploit it. "But I know this, Watson. Cedric Ashford left a mark. Not of guilt. I maintain what I said last night, that guilt is a largely unproductive indulgence, but of awareness. An awareness that the pursuit of truth, to which I have dedicated my life, operates within a system that is necessary and imperfect, and sometimes cruel, and that my role within that system carries consequences I am not always in a position to foresee or mitigate." "You did mitigate," I said gently. "The debts, the arrangement you made. A small thing, an inadequate thing. It did not save him. No, but it may have saved her for a time. And today, what you did today, that was not a small thing, Holmes." He received this without visible response, but I hoped that the words reached him. Holmes was a man of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary limitations, and the limitation that had always seemed to me most poignant was not his much-discussed deficiency of emotion, but his difficulty in recognizing, when emotion did surface, that it was something to be honored rather than merely analyzed. The fire had burned up well now, casting a warm, steady light that filled the room with the comfortable amber glow I associated with the best of our evenings together. Holmes reached for his pipe, considered it, and set it down again, a small gesture that told me he was not yet ready to retreat into the familiar rituals of his evening routine, that there was more to be said, or at least more to be felt before the day's extraordinary chapter could be fully closed. "She will not come back," he said. "Not to Baker Street. Whether she finds peace, genuine peace, not merely the exhaustion of anger, I cannot say. But the narrative that brought her here has been broken. It cannot be reassembled in its original form. What she builds in its place is beyond my power to predict or influence. You gave her the truth, I said. That is more than most people receive. Holmes made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. A small, rueful exhalation that carried the particular flavor of a man who has spent his life in the service of truth and finds himself in this moment uncertain of its sufficiency. The truth, he repeated. Yes. Let us hope it is enough. Supper and silence. Mrs. Hudson arrived with supper at 7:30, and her timing, as in all things, was impeccable. She had prepared a cold collation of the kind she favored on evenings when the household schedule had been disrupted. Sliced ham, good bread, a wedge of Stilton that had reached the precise point of ripeness at which it becomes less an accompaniment than a destination, and a salad of watercress and beetroot that provided a freshness the heavier items required. There was also, I noted with quiet appreciation, a small pot of mustard and a dish of pickled onions, additions that suggested Mrs. Hudson had sensed, through whatever domestic intuition informed her management of our household, that the evening called for comfort rather than ceremony. We ate at the table by the window, a practice we sometimes adopted on evenings when the formality of the dining table felt excessive and the informality of eating from trays in our chairs felt insufficient. Holmes applied himself to the meal with more appetite than I expected, selecting bread and ham and cheese with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who has learned, perhaps only recently, to appreciate the restorative properties of simple nourishment after a period of considerable expenditure. I watched him eat with the discreet satisfaction of a physician and a friend, reading in his appetite a sign that the afternoon's emotional demands had not depleted him beyond recovery. We spoke of other things. I mentioned a concert I had attended earlier in the week at St. James's Hall, a program of Schubert that had reminded me, as Schubert invariably does, that melancholy and beauty are not opposites, but collaborators, each deepening the other in ways that neither could achieve alone. Holmes listened with genuine interest and asked a question about the pianist's interpretation of the impromptu in G-flat that revealed, as his musical observations always did, an understanding of the art that went considerably deeper than his habitual pose of selective ignorance might have suggested. Holmes, in turn, mentioned a letter he had received from a botanist in Edinburgh who was investigating the regional variations of certain moss species found on limestone formations in the Scottish Highlands, a subject of apparently limitless fascination to its correspondent and of surprisingly sustained interest to Holmes, who had maintained the correspondence for several years and spoke of the botanist with a warmth that suggested genuine intellectual kinship. I understood as I listened that this too was an act of restoration, the deliberate re-engagement with the broader world of knowledge and inquiry that constituted, for Holmes, the most reliable form of renewal. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest. Not the dramatic, wind-swept rain of a proper storm, but the steady, vertical, unhurried rain of an autumn evening. The kind that falls with a consistency suggesting it has made a commitment to the night and intends to see it through. The sound of it against the windows was companionable rather than melancholy, a gentle, persistent percussion that seemed to draw the walls of the room closer together, contracting the world to the dimensions of this warm, well-lit space in which two men sat eating bread and cheese and talking about moss and Schubert while the city outside submitted to the patient ministrations of the weather. Mrs. Hudson cleared the dishes with her customary quiet efficiency, pausing at the door to ask whether we required anything further. Holmes thanked her with a warmth that I noticed exceeded his usual register of polite acknowledgement, and she received it with the faintly surprised expression of a woman unaccustomed to effusiveness from that quarter, followed by a small, gratified nod that suggested the warmth, whatever its cause, was not unwelcome. The fire burned, the rain fell, The room held us. Watson alone. Holmes retired early. It was not yet 10 o'clock, an hour at which he would ordinarily be deep in his evening's occupation, whether that involved chemical analysis, musical practice, or the intensive study of whatever obscure subject had most recently captured his interest. And his decision to seek his bed was, I understood, less a concession to fatigue than an acknowledgment that the day had asked of him something he was not accustomed to giving, and that the reserves it had drawn upon required the particular restoration that only solitude and sleep could provide. "Good night, Watson," he said, rising from his chair with a motion that combined his characteristic grace with an uncharacteristic slowness. He paused at the door, his hand upon the frame, his figure half in the lamplight of the sitting room and half in the shadow of the hallway beyond, and turned back to me with an expression that I shall remember for as long as memory persists. It was not a dramatic expression. It carried no great emotion visibly displayed, but it communicated, in the particular language that long companionship develops between two people who have shared the better part of their adult lives, a depth of gratitude and affection that Holmes would never have been capable of articulating in words, and that I would never have been graceless enough to demand. "Good night, Holmes," I said, and he was gone, his footsteps ascending the stair to his bedroom with the quiet, measured tread of a man who has completed a long day's work and is at last permitted to set it down. I sat alone in the sitting room, and the solitude that gathered around me was not loneliness, but its gentler cousin, the peaceable aloneness of a man who is in the right place at the right hour, with the right thoughts for company. The fire had settled into its late evening character, burning low but steadily, producing more warmth than light, its embers pulsing with a slow, deep rhythm that seemed to synchronize, as I watched, with the rhythm of my own breathing. I thought about Mrs. Graves, about Eleanor. I thought about the journey she was making now, the cab to King's Cross, the train northward through the rain, the darkened countryside sliding past the carriage windows, and at the end of it, the house in Hertfordshire, where Mrs. Calloway would be waiting, perhaps with a lamp in the window, perhaps with a late supper warming on the stove, and where the writing desk with its locked drawer would be waiting too. The drawer that had never held a cameo brooch, but that held, I imagined, other things, letters, photographs, the small material relics of a life lived and lost and mourned with a devotion that had nearly consumed the mourner. I thought about grief and the forms it takes when it has nowhere constructive to go. I had known grief myself, the loss of my wife, a wound that time had gentled but never fully healed, had taught me something about the way sorrow, when it is not permitted expression, does not diminish but transforms, seeking outlets that may bear little resemblance to the original loss. Mrs. Graves's rage against Holmes was not, at its root, rage at all. It was love, Cedric's love, redirected through the prism of his absence into the only shape that seemed to offer purpose: blame. To blame Holmes was to keep Cedric's story alive. To seek retribution was to affirm that his life had mattered, that his destruction had been unjust, that someone, somewhere, should be held to account for the waste of a human being who had deserved better than the fate that found him. I did not judge her. I found, sitting in the quiet of that room with the rain whispering against the glass and the fire keeping its patient vigil in the grate, that what I felt was something closer to admiration, not for her plan, which was desperate and wrong and would have produced only further devastation, but for the ferocity of the love that had driven it. To carry grief for 7 years without relief, to channel it into a purpose however misguided, to travel to London with a revolver in a leather bag, and sit in a stranger's chair and maintain composure while the detective you intend to kill pours you tea. This required a kind of courage that I could recognize even as I recoiled from its expression. She was, in her terrible way, magnificent. I picked up my pen from the writing desk, turned it in my fingers and set it down again. Some stories, I reflected, need time before they can be written. The events of this evening were too close, too warm, too human to be reduced yet to narrative. They needed to settle, to find their shape in the deeper strata of memory, where the urgent and the incidental sort themselves according to a wisdom that the conscious mind cannot replicate. One day, perhaps, I would write this account, but not tonight. The night settles. I rose from my chair and began the small, familiar rituals of closing the evening, those unhurried domestic ceremonies that mark, for those who live in well-established routines, the transition from wakefulness to rest. The fire required banking. I arranged the coals with the poker, drawing the larger pieces to the center, and building a border of ash around them that would contain the heat through the night and leave a bed of embers from which Mrs. Hudson could coax the morning's first flames without starting from cold. It was an act I had performed hundreds of times, and its very familiarity, the weight of the poker, the particular sound of coal shifting against coal, the faint warmth that rose to meet my hands, carried a comfort that no novelty could have matched. I checked the door to the landing, confirming that it was latched but not locked. Holmes occasionally descended in the night for a book or a thought, and I had learned long ago that a locked door between his restlessness and his library produced more disruption than it prevented. The gas was turned low in the hallway, leaving a faint, companionable glow that softened the darkness without dispelling it. I drew the sitting room curtains fully closed, shutting out the rain-washed night, and in the moment before the fabric met, I paused and looked out at Baker Street. The street was quiet. The rain had slowed to a fine, persistent mist that haloed the gas lights in coronas of diffused gold and gave the pavement a dark, reflective sheen, as though the city had been varnished for the night. A single cab stood at the distant corner, its driver hunched beneath a waterproof, its horse standing with the stoic patience of an animal long accustomed to the indignities of English weather. No pedestrians were visible. The houses opposite showed scattered lights in their upper windows, the private constellations of other lives, other evenings, other rooms in which other people were making their own transitions from the demands of the day to the mercies of the night. Somewhere out there, beyond these streets, beyond the city's edge, somewhere in the darkened countryside through which a northbound train was carrying her home, Eleanor Graves was traveling. I pictured her in a railway carriage, her traveling case on the seat beside her, lighter now by the weight of a small revolver, her reflection ghosting in the rain-streaked window as the lights of London fell away behind her. I wondered what she was seeing in that reflection. I wondered whether the face that looked back at her from the dark glass was the same face she had carried to Baker Street, or whether it had already begun to change, subtly, imperceptibly, the way a landscape changes when a cloud that has long obscured the sun finally, silently moves on. I hoped she would sleep tonight. I hoped that the weight she had set down in our sitting room, that terrible, concentrated weight of blame and purpose and unresolved love, would not find its way back to her shoulders in the morning. I knew that grief does not dissolve in a single afternoon, however extraordinary. I knew that the structure she had built would not simply vanish because their foundation had been revealed as incomplete. But I hoped, with the quiet, persistent, perhaps irrational hope of a man who has spent his life trying to heal what can be healed and comfort what cannot, that something had shifted, that the crack Holmes had opened in her certainty would admit, over time, enough light to illuminate a different path, that she would find, in the ruins of the narrative she had carried for 7 years, the materials from which a new and truer understanding might be built. I turned from the window, drew the curtains closed, and extinguished the sitting room lamp. The room settled into a darkness softened by the glow of the banked fire, a warm, amber darkness that held the shapes of the furniture in gentle silhouette, and that smelled, as it always smelled, of tobacco and books and the faint, ineradicable trace of the countless evenings that had been lived within these walls. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom. The third step creaked, as it always creaked, a small domestic announcement that I had long since ceased to notice consciously, but that registered each night as a marker of passage, a threshold between the shared spaces of the day and the private territory of the night. The upper landing was dark and still, and from behind Holmes's closed door, I heard the faint, steady rhythm of his breathing, deep and even, the breathing of a man who had found, after a day of uncommon difficulty, the refuge of sleep. It was a sound so familiar that it had become, over the years, a form of companionship in itself, the audible evidence of a presence I could not see, but knew to be there, reliable as the clock, constant as the walls. I entered my room, undressed in the near darkness, and settled into bed. The sheets were cool against my skin, then warming, conforming to the contours of my body with the patient accommodation of good linen. The pillow received my head, the blanket drew close, and the rain, that steady, faithful, unhurried rain, continued its gentle work upon the windows, upon the roof, upon the city, laying its soft percussion over everything like a benediction. The world beyond this room was vast and dark and full of griefs I could not mend, full of women traveling through the night toward houses that would not feel like home until something inside them healed, full of men sleeping behind closed doors, carrying in their brilliant, burdened minds the knowledge that being right is not always the same as being whole, full of old debts and old loves and old wounds that open and close with the seasons like flowers that bloom in the dark where no one sees them. But tonight, in this house, in this street, in this room where the rain spoke quietly against the glass and the warmth of the fire still lingered in the bones of the walls, one small act of understanding had been enough. Not enough to undo what had been done, not enough to restore what had been lost, but enough to change the shape of a single evening and perhaps, the shape of the days that would follow it. I closed my eyes. The rain continued. The house was still, and sleep, that most merciful of companions, drew near at last, settling over Baker Street, like a quilt drawn gently across the shoulders of someone who has been cold for a very long time and is only now, finally, beginning to grow warm.